So we're here with Dr. Jay Carney and Dr. Max Engel of Creighton University. Thank you both for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you.
Talk a little bit about some of the research you've done with the intersection of the Catholic faith and sport. You co-authored, along with another professor from the University of Alberta, a book, Eighth Day, A Catholic Theology of Sport. So why did you see the need to tackle this field of research?
Max and I have taught a course here at Creighton called Sport and Spirituality for multiple years now. And we found, as you might expect, that students love the topic. Many of them come out of high school sports themselves and have had truly formative, but often also challenging experiences in sport. Some of them come from religious backgrounds, some do not. I think almost universally, they don't necessarily immediately connect sport and spirituality and religion. So part of our goal with both the class and the book is to help students to start to see some of the connections between those two worlds, where the students can really make sense of that within their own experience.
How about the key takeaways from your research? What would you say those would be?
Well, sports are really important, and there's a lot of potential. There's a rich potential to evangelize. Not necessarily the rah-rah, but in many cases, a lot of the suffering and the loss in sports is an opportunity to encounter Jesus through the Paschal mystery. And so it's getting students to look more deeply at their sports experience and seeing and recognizing what's been there all along, what they haven't noticed, whether it's grace, Paschal mystery. The communal relationships are deeply Trinitarian. The sacrificial nature that they're called to give of themselves for the team, and inviting them to see how that correlates with Jesus's message in their everyday lives. So we've had a lot of success in getting students to think more deeply about that. And sports are an easy entree to then transition to or bring into conversation theology and their experience with sports.
And obviously ritual is a big part of faith, but you guys have also looked at superstitions versus ritual. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. So superstition in our mind has to do with control. It's also something that can come up in prayer. It's the negotiating with God. God, if I do this, will you do this? And the problem with superstition is you're trying to control something, one that's not empirical, right? So there's a difference between, say, a pre-performance routine that helps me prepare for a game versus I'm going to wear this watch because it always makes me win. But from a spiritual perspective, we can say something's not empirical. We can say God is real, but to us, but that's still different than saying, well, I'm going to control God or control what happens out in this realm. So we like to discuss ritual and prayer as more of a communion with God, more of building a relationship. And I think in the world of sport, that can allow you to flourish, to be your best self. In that sense, I think prayer can help us be better athletes. But that's different than saying, I'm going to pray this way and God will make sure that field goal goes through.
So taking that a little further, what about the baseball player who blesses himself before he steps in the batter's box, or in the post-game interview, the athlete gives all glory to God? Is that a bad thing?
We ask students that question. We put them on the spot. Kind of, where is that coming from? In sort of two quick stories, the genesis for the course came from an interview that we were watching independently with Dabo Swinney. And he told the interviewer, after the big game where Clemson won, like, all glory to God. And I texted Jay and said, what is he talking about? What does he mean by that? And then similarly, there was a hotshot pitcher here at Creighton 7-8 years ago who, just as you said, would make a sign of the cross. He'd strike someone out. He'd point to the sky. He wore the medallions, the Saints medals. And I had him in my office and we're having some conversation about what that meant for him. And he really didn't know. And so we invite students, we equip them to understand the difference between a pre-performance routine versus superstition, which is pre-performance routine, superstition, and ritual, and sort of ask them to get into the motivation of themselves, their peers, and kind of identify how they would operate given their relationship with the living God and what's appropriate for them, not so much judging others, but being able to articulate for themselves what the practices they employ and what it means for them.
So what are the characteristics that you found that kind of cross over between faith and between sports? I'm talking about things like, courage, teamwork. What are those kind of traits that are similar between
Sure.
the two?
Yeah, we try to talk in the class, as you might expect, about moral virtue and the ethics of sport. So that can obviously get into questions of cheating or doping or gamesmanship. But there's also I think part of the value of sport for young people and anybody is that it's formative. And In the Catholic tradition, we grow into Christians through our lives and through what we do, and that's the tradition of virtue ethics, that what you do every day shapes you and the kind of person you are. And so I think students often get that through sport, even maybe more than religion, because for, maybe sometimes sadly, religion may be in the background. Maybe I go to church on Sunday or not, but often the most formative part of their life is actually in sport. And so I do think we try to broaden, sometimes in sport, like character schools of sport, it's all about, you do hear language around, courage or hard work or discipline, and those obviously matter. But I think from a Christian perspective, like where do, something like communion, forgiveness, mercy, what role do those sorts of values play in sport, and what might a Christian lens bring that might be different than, say, just what your high school volleyball coach, told you to just go hard and be disciplined. So
we've all seen the numbers about mass attendance going down, and since sport is so popular with both, in particular, youth and young adults, can sports be used, do you think, as a potential platform to evangelize and to maybe bring some of those people back to the faith?
So Catholics lag in this area. I mean, our evangelical brothers and sisters, I think, do a better job of having a platform, having prominent athletes give witness and testimony to their relationship with God, or how they encounter Jesus. I think there's definitely a place for that. And I think we as Catholics have a responsibility to look at that potential to use sports as a platform. But having said that, I think there are limitations. We think there's a holistic look at that. That's part of a much larger piece of, someone may not desire to use their athletic prominence in social media, in interviews in such a way, but yet they can still give deep testimony by how they compete, how they conduct themselves, how they approach the game, and especially in a coaching scenario, how they form, as Jay said, how they form the men and women who compete with them and for them.
So you look at the huge marquee sports events, the World Series, the March Madness, the Super Bowl, society almost stops and everything comes to a halt. I mean, you had a world record, the biggest TV audience ever for this past Super Bowl, 124 million people all watching the same TV show. Is that a sign that sports has reached almost the status of a pseudo-religion in our society?
Yeah, that's a question we also engage in our class, and we have some ambivalence around that. I think on a functional level, if you think of religion as the most important thing in my life, I think for many young people, older super fans, I think of the Dr. Pepper Fansville guys, that this is a religion. But I think at a deeper level, religion is more than just whatever's important to me. It's also about giving people a worldview, giving them a deeper set of values. It's about connecting with the transcendent God who's real to us and around the world. It's about deeper traditions that have been handed down to us. And so I think we try to recognize the importance of sport, but also to recognize that and this can be hard language, but to recognize sport might be closer to an idol than to a religion, right? Mm-hmm. It's a good thing, but like all idols, it becomes a problem when you try to elevate it to something it's not meant to be. So,
and yet we've all heard, whether it's Creighton basketball, Husker football, described as a religion. We know Husker and Creighton fans are very passionate. Is there a danger too in the athletes who play that sport, into turning them into gods with a small g that we're worshiping?
Yeah, and I think the danger goes two ways. I think it's when we put people on a pedestal and expect them to be something they're not. As you use the term God, with seeing them as human and flawed. But it's also, we've seen it, there's story after story, of it's detrimental to the athlete themselves when they get a warped sense of entitlement or their sense of value, their sense of worth. And that's not just for prominent athletes. We see this in youth athletes and high school athletes, when their center of meaning and value as a 14-year-old is contingent on their ability to put a leather ball through a hoop or to throw an oblong football down the field. And when those dreams don't come true, or when something endangers that, an injury, or they don't grow as expected, that's really detrimental to their growth, to their formation. So there's a lot to be concerned about when we put people on pedestals that they're not meant to be put on.
So what can we as Catholics take away from sports to make us better Catholics? And what can sport take away from religion to make them better at sport?
Well, I would draw here on the modern popes have spoken extensively about the role of sport, as John Paul II said, to build a civilization of love. Pope Francis often talks about sport's role in building a culture of encounter. And so I think in a really positive way, sport can cross national, ethnic, political lines. It can bring people together who might not otherwise be there. Obviously, it's competitive, but there's even a way where it can structure competition so that it's not just zero-sum destruction, but we compete hard and then we walk away, we shake hands. I think that's all very positive. I do think religion can bring to sport, as Max said, that the popes would use this language too, that the sport is a beautiful gift, right? In the modern world, it becomes a problem when it gets overly exalted. It's not good for athletes. It's not good for coaches. And so to bring going back to Pius XII and forward, the popes would talk about the attitude of redemption, right? And so how can we see the good in sport, but also some of the challenges and even some of the sins, and bring a Christian faith lens to that to really redeem the experience, particularly for athletes, for fans, etc. And I think to direct that toward the flourishing of the human person and human dignity.
So you bring up the popes. So which pope do you think did the most to advance recognition and acknowledgement that sports is something religion needs to pay attention to? Is it John Paul II? Is it Pope Francis?
Yeah, right.
Where do we go?
Well, in a Catholic world where sometimes people choose their pope, like I like this pope. Sport actually, to use other language, is kind of ecumenical, because going back to even someone like Pius X, all the way up to Pope Francis, the popes have generally agreed that sport is important, that it's formative, it can become problematic. But realistically, I would probably say Pope John Paul II issued over 100 discourses on sport. He himself, as many know, was an alpinist. He was, he brought it from a level of kind of one among multiple cultural engagements to a higher profile. I do think Pope Francis has continued that and probably broadened it out, to, for example, one of the Vatican dicasteries has a particular focus on sport at the service of humanity. And has really sort of extended that as a real ministry throughout the church. So I'm going to call for a tie, a Francis, John Paul, teaming up, going together.
Take an easy way.
Right.
That's great. So professional sports teams often have sports chaplains. Is this a recognition, and they've had them for years, are they ahead of the curve in saying that someone's spiritual life can impact their professional life or their athletic life by nurturing that along the way?
Yeah, I think that there's a certain, in professional sports chaplains, there's a certain element of ambiguity. At their best, it is when the community, when the organization recognizes that this is an avenue for care for the men or women who are in our employ, not just the athletes, but the support staff, the trainers, the coaches, that we provide an opportunity to nourish this growth, this spiritual growth. And I think that that's very healthy and that's very life-giving. There can be a cynicism to that too, and we've encountered this, and you can read about this, where coaches are interested in religious practice or prayer as an opportunity to coalesce the team, to sort of keep the team under the control, and ultimately their end is not necessarily the betterment of the athlete. Their goal to foster this or fund this is victories in the win column. And so that takes the same idea of a sports chaplaincy, and I think sort of sinful pride, there's an element that degrades its potential to be what it really often is. But that's a lot like life in general. There's something that potentially can be very good. How are we going to approach that? What's the disposition of our hearts when we engage something like a sports chaplaincy? So I'd like to think that there's more of the positive side in that, sort of an authentic sense of encounter. We want what's best for our athletes, win or lose. I do think there's an element in our society or in coaches that see that as another way for them to enhance the opportunity for them to get more victories. So it can cut both ways.
You have a seminar coming up this summer around the College World Series time, I believe, that you're going to be talking about this particular topic. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
So it's a Vatican-initiated series of conferences, conventions. As Jay mentioned, Pope Francis convened in 2016. There have been a number of conferences since in North America. It's sport at the service of humanity. And it's Pope Francis recognized, hey, this is really important. Sports are important to people. Let's elevate sports to better enhance human flourishing, enhance human communion, and really get some conversation about both the positives of sports, the rah-rah stuff, but also like how can we as a community, Western Iowa, Eastern Nebraska, kind of the Midlands, what can we do at sports, youth through professional, to make sure that we're maximizing the potential of sports to be life-giving for all people in all circumstances.
So you're both sports fans, you're both researchers. As you've really taken the deep dive into this particular topic, and I want you to both answer this, what surprised you? Has anything really jumped out at you that I didn't think about it that way?
Yeah, for me, I think when having been an athlete in high school, as an adult doing triathlons, as a collegiate rower, never been challenged to say, hey, what's your baptism have to do with your love for sport? And then when I put myself on that, give myself that question, and at first years ago, recognizing how inadequate my responses were, I thought, as a sports aficionado, as a budding theologian, realizing, I have a lot of work to do. And then turning around and realizing so many other people do. And so what I've learned about grace and forgiveness, Paschal mystery and Trinity and incarnation, and how that applies to sports has deeply enriched my understanding of sports, my coaching of sports, youth level down. Helping others encounter that and realize that too has been surprising in a way that it's life-giving. It's exciting for me. So if you equate surprising with exciting, seeing other people go, oh, I see what you're talking about. That makes sense to me. I didn't realize what community has to do with God's love for us. I didn't realize what sacrifice for the team had to do with Jesus' sacrifice for us. I didn't realize what life, death, resurrection of Jesus had to do with my season-ending injury when I was in high school. And seeing that growth has been very gratifying. And I think that the acclaim that our work has garnered has been a little bit surprising to us. People are hungry for meaning. And if we can use sports to help them and realize that meaning, that's all to the better.
Yeah, that's just echo. I think two insights out of our writing and some of our teaching that stand out to me. One was the role of suffering in sport. I think to go back to one of your earlier questions, there is often this naive, like, thank God when things go well and thank God after the victory. But our God is we worship a crucified Messiah. And the message of the cross is that God doesn't save us from suffering. God doesn't save us from death, but redemption comes through that. And I think in obviously a much lower level way, I think sport can often do that for people. And so I think for me, the moving stories in class, with students around injuries, around cuts, around just some of the pain they've dealt with in sport, but also helping them to see a spiritual path forward out of that, to see that just because you didn't win the championship didn't mean God wasn't in that. And sometimes that God's actually in it more, when you've suffered. And then probably the second big insight that's come to me is around the question of freedom, because we do live in a modern world that, especially in the West, it tends to understand freedom as just complete autonomy. I do whatever I want. I'm an individual. And often for young people, that's their default language. And if you just come at it strictly from religion, they resist. But when you start talking about a team, like, okay, yeah, imagine the team. Everybody just does what they want. That's right. I live complete autonomy, because nobody's going to tell me what to do. Like, no, I was on a team like that and we fell apart. And so in a way, there's insights in the Catholic tradition that, freedom's about flourishing within boundaries. It's about responding to God's call. It's about, coming into relationship with others and respecting limits, and that all those things we also see in sport. And so it's a kind of inductive evangelization that in this experience you've had, actually you're seeing deeper truth about human life. So
Dr. Jay Carney, Dr. Max Engel, Creighton University, thank you both for being with us. Great insights. And the book is On the Eighth Day, Catholic Theology of Sport. Thanks again for being with us.
Okay. Thank you, Dennis. Appreciate your time.